Hello, and welcome to Episode 3 of Sarastro's Star Wars Legion painting series. In this episode we're going to paint the AT-RT from Fantasy Flight Games' Star Wars Legion. The AT-RT is an incredibly fun miniature to paint, and can be as simple or as involved as you like. Let's take a look at the painting stages. I'm going to prime the figure in black, followed with some zenithal highlights as detailed in the previous episode, although a plain prime in grey would also be fine. We're then going to provide some simple base colours which will include some optional design elements and the use of a sponge to create some chipped paint effects. We can then shade the entire miniature with a dark wash and provide some optional highlights to boost the contrast. We'll then finish the miniature off by having some fun with some weathering and rust effects and creating a scenic base. Let's begin. The AT-RT comes in 8 separate parts and has 3 different weapons to choose from. If you want to simply provide a single base colour and shade to the AT-RT, then there would be nothing wrong with assembling the miniature now, although I would still paint the rider separately. As I'm going to provide some more careful highlights and some graphic elements to the bodywork, I've chosen to paint the vehicle in separate parts for now and assemble it later. I am however going to glue on the rider's arms. I'm then going to use some poster putty to mount all of the separate pieces of the AT-RT to a couple of pencils. This will allow us to prime and paint the parts without having to handle them directly, except for the central body part which I'll be holding by the pegs to allow full 360-degree access. We can now prime the figure, and I'm first priming in black, followed with a grey and a white zenithal highlight from above. But a plain prime in black, white or grey would also be fine, with grey being my preference. And of course you don't need to use an airbrush, as a spray can primer would be just as good for a plain prime. Here you can see I'm applying the grey and white highlights from above. Once done, I'm going to paint the trooper using the same colours and techniques as detailed in Episode 2. And naturally, you'll want to paint your trooper to match whatever colour scheme you've chosen for your army. Let's now turn our attention to painting the AT-RT, starting with the base colours. There are many colours you could use to paint the body of the vehicle. Most shades of pale grey, for example, such as Celestra Grey, would be just fine. And you can still follow all of the preceding steps regardless of your choice of base colour. For my AT-RT, I've chosen to use a roughly 3:2 mix of Vallejo's Deck Tan and Stormhost Silver. I'm adding the silver partly to desaturate the beige, creating a more subtle grey colour, but also to impart a gentle metallic sheen. To speed up the painting, I'm using a larger size 6 flat brush by Rosemary & Co, and you can see I've kept the paint consistency pretty thick. As I paint the vehicle, I'm pulling the flat of the brush down over the surface without necessarily getting paint into the recessed details, which we want to remain dark. I'll be painting some of these areas, such as the engine parts, with a dark metallic colour in a moment, but you could simply use the one colour for the entire vehicle if you like. At this point we could dry brush on some pure white to create some quick and easy edge definition. To do this, we load the brush with some undiluted paint, then wipe most of it off. We then lightly drag or flick the flat of the brush over the surface of the miniature, so that the raised edges and textures pick up most of the paint. Dry brushing can result in a somewhat chalky finish, which is fine if we're looking for a slightly weathered result. The darker your base colour, the more pronounced the effect will be, and you may wish to use something slightly darker than pure white if the result looks too stark. Once done, if you don't want to add any other colours or graphical elements to your AT-RT, you could now skip to the shading stage if you like. To add interest, I've chosen to paint on some sections of colour using German uniform. I'm using it here for some of the panelling on the legs. We'll be adding some chipping and distress to these areas later on, so we shouldn't worry if things aren't perfect. I'm also going to freehand a basic geometric design on the frontal armour plating. You can see that my approach here is to draw the outline first, then fill the area in. For detailed work like this, it might help to think of the brush more like a pencil, which we would normally use with considerable accuracy. We can of course tidy up any scrappy edges with the pale grey colour. Next I'm going to paint on a central square with some German grey. I'm now going to create a simple chipped paint effect by using a piece of sponge to dab on some of the pale grey colour onto the areas of green, thus giving the impression of parts of the green paint having chipped off over time. You can test this out before applying the effect, so you know roughly what kind of textures to expect. You'll probably want to work quite tentatively at first, focusing mostly around the edges of the panels where we might expect the most chipping to have occurred. Finally, for the base colours, I'm going to use a roughly equal mix of Leadbelcher and German grey for all of the guns and the other separate parts. You could also use this for one or two sections of the main body if you wish. Here I'm painting some pale sections of the body which I missed earlier. With the base colours complete, we're ready to add some shade. I'm now going to shade the entire miniature with some Nuln Oil. After giving the bottle a good shake, I usually like to transfer some of the shade to a palette, simply because the bottles are surprisingly easy to knock over. Working on one piece at a time, I'm now covering the miniature with the shade. We can see how nicely this darkens the recesses and brings definition to the model. As soon as I've covered the whole piece, I'm going to gently brush off the excess from the topmost surfaces with a Q-tip. This is simply to minimise the darkening effect of the shade for those surfaces that we want to appear highlighted. We can also use a damp brush to soak up any unwanted excess. I'm not worried about wiping the shade from the weapons, as they're so dark anyway. There's nothing wrong with using a hairdryer to speed up the drying time, provided you don't get too close and melt the plastic. For the central armoured section, I've chosen to thin the Nuln Oil down with a roughly equal measure of Lahmian medium. This is just because I want to reduce the darkening effect further for this central focal point of the model. I'm once again brushing off the excess from all of the flat areas, leaving just a subtle level of shade in the recesses. Once done, we're ready to add some optional highlights. I'm now going to return to the original pale base tone to provide a few highlights to the bodywork. Here I'm applying the paint quite thinly to the circular joints and pushing the pigments up towards the highest point. I'm also brightening all of the obvious upturned facets of the vehicle. And we can use the side of the brush to pick out any prominent edges. We can push things further with the addition of some white in a couple of stages. As already mentioned, these highlights certainly aren't essential to achieve a good tabletop standard. If you do have a go, however, it's worth remembering that we'll be adding some further chipping and weathering later on that can also be used to cover up any parts we might not be happy with. For the darker metallic areas, including the guns, I've chosen to begin the highlights with a roughly equal mix of Stormhost Silver and German Grey. This is a little darker than I would usually go when highlighting things like the weapons, simply because these guns are so large, so I'd like to build the highlights up a bit more gradually. I'm now brightening the highlights with the addition of some deck tan in a couple of stages. You can see I'm applying these highlights just to the tops of the weapons. Here's my brightest highlight tone. Once we're happy with the highlights, we can go ahead and glue the parts together. I'm going to start by gluing on the right leg. I'm then going to glue the longer of the two struts into the larger and smaller holes provided on the body and the leg respectively. And we can do the same with the left leg. I'm now gluing on the central section of armour. And now the rider and the remaining handlebar. And finally, I'm gluing on the aerials, with the larger of the two nearer the front. We're now ready to add some finishing touches. Before we proceed, I'm going to temporarily mount the vehicle to the base with some poster putty. I'm now going to apply some chipped paint effects to the paler sections of the ATRT. To do that, I'm using a roughly equal mix of Leadbelcher and black, and I'm once again using a piece of sponge to dab the effect on. I'm taking care to leave space for some different coloured chips, which I'll be adding in a moment. I'm now going to create some more rusty sections of chipped paint. You could use any dark reddish-brown tone you like for this, but I've chosen to use a mix of Secret Weapons Red Rust and Citadel's Typhus Corrosion. I've chosen to mix in the Typhus Corrosion because I like the slightly gritty texture it produces. I'm aiming to balance one or two larger patches of rust with several smaller patches. I'm now going to use some orange rust to create some more varied tones and effects. I'm going to firstly apply this roughly inside some of the larger patches of rust. This can be done with most shades of orangey brown. We can also thin this right down and glaze it over some of the broader areas of corrosion. This can be built up in a couple of layers, and we can also create some streaking for the flatter areas like you can see here. As an additional optional touch, I've chosen to use a pale mix of deck tan and white to add a few glinting highlights to suggest the raised texture of the peeling paint. I'm applying this roughly around the edges of the larger patches of rust and chipped paint. We can then tone this down with another thin glaze of the orange rust. The Typhus Corrosion can also be used on its own to add some oily grime effects. This can be applied neat, or it can be thinned like I've done here for a more subtle level of staining. For the guns, I've chosen to brush on some of the red rust and Typhus Corrosion mix, which I've thinned down to create a dark rust-coloured wash. I'm also going to mix some Rhinox Hide with some black to create a smoky deposit effect for the tips of the weapons. I'm applying this quite thinly in a couple of layers to build the effect up. We can now turn our attention to the base, and I'm once again providing some texture using Vallejo's Brown Earth basing paste. Before I do, I'm going to mark the ends of the firing arcs around the edge. I'm then applying the paste. After around half an hour, once that's partially set, I'm going to use a ruler to impress the firing arcs into the texture, using the markers I added earlier as a guide. Once fully dry, I'm going to apply some additional paste where the feet are going to be, and use this to adhere the model to the base. I'm then going to shade the base, and I've chosen a 3:1 mix of Athonian Camoshade and Agrax Earthshade. I'm then adding the same turf and modelling grit as used in the previous episode. When applying the PVA, I'm taking care to avoid the lines of the firing arcs. After brushing off the excess basing material, we can add some additional shade to really help the firing arcs to stand out. Next we can add some additional plants and forest debris, and I'm starting with some pieces of the olive green fine leaf foliage by Woodland Scenics. Different sized pieces of this can be cut off to create smaller trees and shrubs. I'm now going to drill a small hole and glue the plant in place with some superglue. For additional adhesion, you could also press down some green stuff or milliput onto the underside of the base where the stem pokes through. I'm now adding some additional pieces of dried bark and general forest litter. Once we're happy, we can neaten up the rim of the base and spray the figure with some protective matte varnish. Finally, I'm using some poster putty to adhere my weapon of choice, which can then be swapped out as needed. And this completes the ATRT. Thank you for watching. I hope you found the video useful. As always, you can find a full list of products used in the video description. Join me again soon as we move on to painting the forces of the Empire from Star Wars Legion. Happy painting!